Last week, we discussed a free, simple, easy to use method for coaches to quantify their athletes' training load. That is, how hard they're working during every training session. This week, I'm going to show you how to use that same method in periodization. That is, planning the training load before every training session and then going back and monitoring the training load that actually occurred in order to see whether or not you need to make adjustments. This management of training load or load management can literally make the difference between your team optimizing their performance and recovery or losing multiple players to sickness, injury, and overtraining. You're going to want to pay close attention to this one. Welcome to the Soccer Fitness video blog. Hello, I'm Richard Bucciarelli. Before we get started, a quick reminder that I'll be providing a free webinar later this week that's going to discuss this topic in much more detail. There's a link to the registration page for the webinar in the video description below. So let's talk about periodization of training. Simply put, periodization is a fancy word for planning of training. And when we talk about planning training, what we're really talking about is planning training load. We learned last week that there are two variables which together make up training load, and those are volume and intensity of training. Periodization simply means the planning out of volume and intensity of training for each training session and for each group or cycle of training sessions in order to achieve optimal results. So how exactly do you determine how much volume and how much intensity you need out of each training session and each group or cycle of training sessions in order to achieve these optimum results? You can determine all of that based on the principle of progressive overload. The principle of progressive overload states that in order for any physical or physiological system to improve its function, then the stresses or overloads that are presented to that system need to be presented in small, incrementally increasing steps. In this way, the stress or overload is great enough to force the system to adapt and improve its function, but not so great that it overwhelms the system, which leads to the system breaking down. So periodization or planning of training in a team sport like soccer is typically done using the concept of weekly training cycles. Let's simplify this a little bit. In a team sport like soccer, athletes can really only handle between 2 to 3 high training load days in a week. If a soccer season includes 1 game per week, then what that means is that the game is automatically treated as one of those high training load days. So you really can only include 1 or at a maximum 2 more high training load days in each weekly training cycle. So here's an example of what a weekly training cycle might look like for a team that trains every day of the week. As you can see, there are only 2 peaks or days where the training load is as high as possible. And in between those peaks, there are other days where the training load is much lower. These lower training load days are what allow for recovery in between the peaks or high training load days. And this is the best way to stimulate a physiological system to improve without overloading the system. So now that we know what a typical weekly cycle in soccer should look like, how do we apply the principle of progressive overload from one weekly cycle to the next in order to optimize results? As mentioned previously, that must be done with small, progressively incremental increases in training load. Ideally, the increases in training load from one weekly cycle to the next should be between the range of 5 and 20%. This range is sufficient in order to get a physical system to adapt or improve, but not so high that the system would not be able to handle the increase in training load and break down. So let's have a closer look at what a monthly cycle of training that includes 4 smaller weekly cycles of training might look like. As you can see, week 1 has a certain training load, and in week 2, the training load is progressively, incrementally increased from what it was in week 1. Once again, in week 3, the load is higher than it was in week 2, and finally, in week 4, the training load is decreased quite significantly, and that's called a deloaded or detraining week, which is really great to allow for optimal recovery. This standardized 4-week cycle is a fairly common one that's used in sports like soccer, so we're going to stick with it for our example in this lesson. So let's now take a closer, much more in-depth look at a weekly training cycle for a typical North American soccer team that trains 3 days per week. As you can see, in week 1, all of the training load calculations, which we learned how to do last week, have been done on the 3 training days to lead up to a total weekly training load for week 1 of 432. Now, for week 2, in keeping with the principle of progressive overload, there have been small incremental increases in training load for each of the 3 training days, which have been achieved by decreasing the time of the rest interval in between each work interval for each training session. This should lead to an increase in intensity. Notice the plan for higher RPE scores, because with less rest in between each work interval, the players should have a more stressful or overloaded response from their system. Now, you might have noticed that while there were increases in training load for each of the 3 training sessions from week 1 to week 2, that those increases were relatively small. And that's normal when you make increases in intensity of training rather than increases in volume. So small incremental increases in training load are typically done more by increasing intensity rather than volume. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit in this video. So from these small increases in intensity, which led to small increases in training load, we've achieved an overall increase in training load from week 1 to week 2 of 432 up to 459, or about 6%. So we're well within the range of 5 to 20% that we discussed earlier that optimizes training load increases based on the principle of progressive overload. So let's have a look at week 3, where once again we've increased training load from what it was in the previous week. Only this time we've done so with a combination of increasing intensity and increasing volume. In day 1 in week 3, we increased intensity much the same way that it was done previously, by decreasing the time of the rest interval once again in order to try to achieve a higher RPE. In days 2 and 3, however, we've increased training load by increasing volume, or the number of repetitions of each specific exercise. And what you'll see is that by increasing volume rather than intensity, you tend to get an overall much higher increase in training load. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is something that soccer coaches and coaches in any other sport for that matter need to be aware of, because when you increase volume even by a little bit, you significantly increase the training load that you're giving to your athletes. So if you're concerned about training load being too high, but you still want to increase training load, it might be better off to try to find ways to increase intensity. Again, we showed it by slightly decreasing rest, and there's lots of other ways to do it. But you might be better off focusing on trying to find ways to increase intensity rather than increasing volume, because whenever you increase volume, as you can see from our example, you get much higher overall increases in training load. So the overall increase in training load from week 2 with a training load of 459 to week 3 with a training load of 519 is 13%. And that's still well within the range of 5 to 20%, which is prescribed based on the principle of progressive overload. And finally, to wrap up this monthly cycle of 4 weekly cycles, we've got a deloaded or detraining week in week 4, where the overall training load for the week is down to just 288, or about 33% lower than it was in week 1. So I want coaches to remember that this is one example of a great way to progressively increase training load, but it's not at all the only way to do it. There are literally an infinite number of ways for coaches to plan to make progressive incremental increases in training load. The key as a coach to get it right is to start by making sure that you plan out volume and intensity for each of your training sessions, and then make sure that in future training sessions you plan and figure out ways to manipulate or increase volume, intensity, or both in order to get a higher training load than you did before. The final piece to the puzzle of periodization of training involves monitoring the training load of every single training session. And if you don't take the time to monitor your training load every single day, then there really is no way that you as a coach can determine whether or not your training plan actually was effective, or whether you may need to make improvements or adjustments to the plan moving forward. Think about it this way. There's no way, no matter how much time and effort you spent putting into your plan, that volume and intensity worked out exactly the way you planned them for each training session and for each player within each training session. So if you're not monitoring what actually happened, then really you're kind of keeping yourself in the dark in terms of exactly how your plan needs to be optimized moving forward. Of course, if things didn't go exactly according to plan, and there's a very good chance that they didn't, then you're probably going to have to make some recalculations for volume and intensity based on the formula that we discussed in last week's video. And you can check that video out in case you missed it here and in the video description below. But by taking the time to do this, you can make sure that your plan is being optimized based on the principle of progressive overload to achieve the results that you want, which again are maximum improvements in players' fitness, optimal recovery, and a significantly decreased risk of injury, sickness, and overtraining. Now, if you'd like a quick, simple, and easy to use example of how you can organize all of your training load information into a spreadsheet to help to keep you on top of your plan, I've provided a quick video tutorial that explains exactly how to do this, a link to which is in the video description below. And finally, as mentioned previously, I'll be providing a free webinar that discusses this topic in much more detail coming up later this week. And you can register for it by clicking on the link in the video description below. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please click like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And as always, please feel free to share this video with anyone who you think may find it interesting. That's it for the blog this week. We'll see you next time, and until then, keep reaching your soccer fitness goals.